Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, February 7th, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about Senator Joe Manchin from the state of West Virginia and the possibility that he might lose or win re-election in the 2024 Senate election that is set to take stage in about 2 years from now. Now, if you're wondering why we're talking about this, it is primarily because the state of West Virginia has gotten a lot more Republican since when Joe Manchin was first elected. Back in the presidential level, the state of West Virginia hadn't really been a state that the Republican Party was winning by 30 to 40 points like they are today. In fact, in the year 2000, the state of West Virginia only went to the GOP by a likely margin, despite in years such as 2012, where Republicans lost the presidential election by, lost compared to win, West Virginia ended up going to the Republicans by an even more solid amount. As the years go further and further and further down the line, West Virginia continues to get more Republican. And in Joe Manchin's last election, he was elected by a margin of 3.3% as a senator who had already been there as the incumbent. Now, the thing about West Virginia is that it isn't likely to elect any other type of Democrat besides Joe Manchin. Jim Justice, the incumbent governor, actually was elected as a Democrat and decided to switch political parties and won by a landslide in 2020. It seems as if that Democrats really struggle being Democrats in West Virginia, even if at heart they may identify with the Democratic Party. That's because West Virginia is just such a solidly Republican state that very few Democrats are able to make it through. And of those who do make it through, they are very similar to Joe Manchin and Jim Justice, that they are culturally conservative, economically conservative, but still identify and affiliate with the Democratic Party. Now, the reason why this video is actually being discussed is because there's some brand new polling data from the 2024 race in West Virginia. And many Democrats sort of cite the fact that West Virginia has continued to shift further and further to the right as a means of telling Joe Manchin that he will not win re-election no matter how he votes in the United States Senate. Putting aside the way that he might truly believe, partisan nature-wise, or his own morality, or what he, believes when it comes down to serving as a senator, the voters from the Democratic side, from more left-leaning states, are making the argument that Joe Manchin simply will not win re-election. That Joe Manchin is in a position where no matter what he does, or what he says, or how much he throttles Joe Biden's administration, that he will simply lose the West Virginia Senate race, and this would be all for nothing. Of course, this argument wouldn't really matter if Joe Manchin was actually voting his conscience. I'm not here to question whether he is or not, but I am going to question about whether or not this strategy that people think to see from Joe Manchin, meaning blocking Biden's agenda as a means of remaining viable and electable for 2024, whether or not that holds up. Now, to give you a bit of context about Joe Manchin as a United States Senate candidate, he won in 2018, but his first election actually was in 2010, but it wasn't the year you're thinking. The type of environment that you're thinking. In 2010, West Virginia actually was more Democratic then than it is today, and that might be surprising to think about, but that was just the reality of it. West Virginia had been a state that had been a long-standing Democratic stronghold, and, George Bush and John McCain were the first Republicans to win it in a while. And seeing West Virginia as a state that actually had an additional Democratic senator from the state, to have two Democrats wasn't unheard of. Many states following the 2008 Senate elections did, and they stuck through that if they weren't having an election in 2010. In the 2010 election, keep in mind this was a red wave, but Joe Manchin actually was serving as the governor. Now, Joe Manchin actually appointed a different person for this vacancy because there was a vacancy that opened up in the state of West Virginia, but he made this appointment with the agreement that he would be able to run for a Senate in the state of West Virginia. And it was, a way that worked effectively. I think that, looking at the history for Joe Manchin and the way that he served as governor, he perfectly propped himself up to become the next United States Senator from West Virginia, and it looks like it's holding true now. One thing that I do want to say is that 2012 was a much better year for Joe Manchin than 2010. Maybe it was the national environment. Maybe Joe Manchin was a better serving United States Senator. We'll wait and see. I think 2024 will definitely give us a determining answer as to whether or not someone who in many ways votes against Democratic Party leadership, or at least throttles them in many ways, can be receiving a positive reaction to that. And because we didn't really see much of a Manchin Senate, really tipping the balance of power in the United States Senate under Obama's leadership, because there were more senators above that majority when Obama had the majority in 2014, so West Virginia residents never really heard Joe Manchin's name mentioned as much as it is now. In addition to that, following the 2016 election and 2014, when Republicans actually won control of the Senate, it gave Joe Manchin an out, meaning that he wouldn't necessarily be talked about as much. He wouldn't be, vilified by the left wing, which in a sense was good for consolidating Democratic Party support in the state of West Virginia, but it actually might have hindered him for 2018. Looking at the results, though Joe Manchin remained somewhat popular across the state, he only won by a margin of 3.3%. If we want to take a look and visualize what that shift and difference was, West Virginia got 20.9% more Republican over the course of just 6 years. And that honestly isn't super shocking. That, along with the state of Missouri and the state of Delaware, the state of West Virginia just simply got so much more Republican culturally, in terms of the elected statewide officials. In terms of the local officials, West Virginia is now a state with a Republican supermajority in almost every single delegation, and it makes sense. They only have Republican representatives. They have one Democrat, one Republican, that one Democrat, of course, being Joe Manchin. Beyond that, Democrats simply have no hope across the state of West Virginia, enough so, like I said in the beginning, that their incumbent governor from 2016, who was elected as a Democrat, switched party lines to become more electable and to more personally identify with a party. Now, seeing what we have experienced with Joe Manchin over the past couple of months, with him throttling the Biden administration, refusing to vote for something such as the $3.5 trillion spending bill, or, going so deep further into that spending bill and drawing it on and on and on, and, giving Democrats a false sense of security, and then giving Democrats, nothing at all. Also, in addition to that, earlier on in 2021, he opposed the filibuster. He opposes it now, opposes changing the filibuster. And that's something that the Democratic Party really can't comprehend, because at the end of the day, for some of these outsiders outside of West Virginia, they view it as Joe Manchin being an unelectable candidate in 2024. This would allow for voting rights. This would allow for a lot of good in the nation, ban partisan gerrymandering, X, Y, and Z. But Joe Manchin doesn't want to abolish the filibuster to get there. He does seem to back the bill. In many ways, all of the Democrats do, including Kyrsten Sinema, who's often mentioned alongside Joe Manchin. But what they won't do is change the filibuster as a response. So we know all of this about Joe Manchin's electoral history and his ability to win in West Virginia and why he does what he does. But is it working for 2024? That is the question that needs to be answered. And a lot of political pundits actually seem to have been changing their minds pretty dramatically, specifically about Joe Manchin. While it might be too early to talk about 2024 fully in depth, it is something to explore for the time being. What we will look at right now is the polling data that has just been released from the state of West Virginia. And this is actually a Republican pollster. Now, these polls were taken on about 3 weeks ago in mid-January 2022. And the polling numbers came out with a response that said that Alex Mooney and Patrick Morrisey, two candidates that have explored or ran for Senate in the state of West Virginia, and Joe Manchin defeats them by a pretty significant amount. There's a number of undecided voters and a number of voters who actually back an additional candidate besides the Republican or Democrat. But in the polling number between Joe Manchin and Jim Justice, it actually only shows Joe Manchin ahead by 4 percentage points. So the interesting thing about this is that this is a Republican pollster. Keep that in mind. This is a pollster that really benefits from having Republicans do well. Yet somehow they couldn't even get, for two of these Republicans, a third of the support in the state of West Virginia on their side. And it reminds me a lot of what we saw in early 2017 and early 2018 in the state of West Virginia in this exact Senate race, which is the same one with Joe Manchin, that earlier on you saw some pretty substantial leads for Joe Manchin. You saw him up 57 to 35, 51 to 37, 45 to 38. A Republican pollster, threw in there a Republican-leaning poll. But then you had 47 to 40, 50 to 42, 52 to 40. What you had was Joe Manchin performing pretty high further out, which gave him a lot of room to fall. And that's exactly what's happening in the state of West Virginia. Now, I'm not going to deny the fact that, the national environment in 2018 was very different than it might be in 2024. That the environment in West Virginia might be very different in 2018 than it was in 2024. But what we are seeing are some very similar trends from early 2017 and late 2017 and early 2018 that indicated a Joe Manchin victory, and we are starting to see that now. While the polling data might be coming a little too early in advance, we're talking about this election over 2 years away, the fact that Joe Manchin is still resonating again with a Republican pollster at 49% and 50% against two Republicans who could very well run, one of them already did, in 2024, it is entirely possible that Joe Manchin could actually expand on that amount, even though it may have seemed extremely unlikely a year ago. And I think a lot of this does have to do with the messaging that we are seeing from the mainstream media. Anytime the Democrats want to get something done, they have to ask Joe Manchin. And maybe West Virginia voters like that power. Because if a Republican actually replaces them, it doesn't give Democrats someone who might end up compromising with them. And it could very well be just a pushback immediately, like what we see with Shelley Moore Capito, who is his counterpart in the United States Senate. And I think while voters in West Virginia would much rather have a Republican in Congress than a Democrat, I don't think they are as upset with Joe Manchin as they might be if Joe Manchin was to never take any of these stances. If Joe Manchin was to treat the state of West Virginia the same way that Ron Johnson treats the state of Wisconsin, meaning coming from a swing state, and I know West Virginia is not a swing state, but it is a state that has a swing tendency when it comes down to this individual Senate race. When you vote with the party opposition to the majority party in a state, you might end up pushing people away. I think a better example of this would potentially be, Susan Collins in the state of Maine. While Maine isn't as Democratic as the state of West Virginia is Republican by any means, it still is a state that Joe Biden won by near double digits in the 2020 election, and there is a Republican senator from there. And keeping that in mind, if a Republican like Susan Collins, like she was to back the Republican Party 100%, she would lose the credibility of being bipartisan, lose the Democratic Party vote, lose the independent vote. And that's what nearly happened in 2020. The Gideon campaign and the Democratic Party consistently ran that 94% number, saying that Susan Collins had voted with Donald Trump 94% of the time. But when it came down to important issues for voters in Maine, such as the Affordable Care Act, or issues such as Amy Coney Barrett, they saw that Susan Collins voted with the Democratic Party. And that screamed bipartisanship. Brett Kavanaugh being there, her voting for Brett Kavanaugh, while something that many Democrats did push against, gave certain other Democrats the ability to either oppose or support the nomination to the Supreme Court in an effort for their own reelection bids. I don't think it was coordinated by any means, but I do think that in electoral politics, when you have someone else taking the fall for being that eventual consequential vote, that's when things are a little bit better for people who otherwise might have taken the fall had that other person not stepped in the way. But Joe Manchin in 2024, personally, I am not confident enough to say that right now, Joe Manchin is unequivocally going to win this race. I think that easily could have been said back in 2012. Even in 2018, this was actually a surprisingly close race. Though the polling data did suggest it, earlier on, we saw that Manchin had some pretty considerable leads further down the line. And as it got closer and closer and closer, and Donald Trump visited the state and constantly was supporting Patrick Morrisey, it became much more difficult for Joe Manchin to win. But again, remember that he was up 14, he was up 13, he was up 11, up 7, up 10, up 8, plus 12, and then all of a sudden, on election day, he wins by just 3.2%. Not a single poll had a Manchin doing as poorly as this, except for one from very early on in May of 2018, WPAI, which is a Republican pollster that had Patrick Morrisey ahead by 2 percentage points. So seeing these early numbers do tell me a bit of a story that Manchin might be able to hold on, contrary to popular belief, contrary to the national environment, but it will be very difficult. He will be working in an environment that will coincide with a presidential election that Republicans are likely to win on the presidential level in West Virginia by an extremely considerable amount. Taking a look at the past elections in West Virginia, what you find is Trump won there by 38.9. 2016, he won by 42.2. 2012, Romney won by 26.8. 2008, it was likely. John McCain only won it by 13.1. In 2004, it was also likely. 12.9. In 2000, it was won by 6.3. Now, keep this in mind. West Virginia was not always a solid red state. And when Joe Manchin was elected, West Virginia was in a position where it was moving right between a 13.1% victory and a 26.8% victory for Mitt Romney. And you can see the dramatic change over time. From the beginning of the 21st century, I don't know why I said 20th. From the beginning of the year 2000, the state of West Virginia has gotten 32.6% more Republican. From 2012, the state of West Virginia has gotten 12.2% more Republican. And we saw that displayed in 2018. And if the state continues this trend, getting further and further to the right, it is entirely possible that by the time Manchin decides to run, that popularity simply won't hold him true. That won't hold him through this election that is expected to be super, super contentious, and an election that is expected to be an extremely close one and potentially an immediate GOP pickup. The state of West Virginia is a state that is going to be very interesting for the next couple of years. I am fascinated by this state's ability to elect Democrats, contrary to their presidential votes that are amongst the most partisan I have seen across the nation. I think that Joe Manchin definitely poses a threat to the GOP in the state, that he could win re-election. His next term, if he is to have one, will in fact be his last, based off of everything that we are expecting. But it also is entirely possible that he runs and loses, or decides to retire if the state of West Virginia continues down this pathway of moving further and further to the right. Because if your last election went from being, 3 points compared to the one prior to, that was won by over 20 percentage points, that's when some major concerns need to be raised. And I think that the Democratic Party very well will raise them for Joe Manchin himself. But some Democrats are extremely angry, saying that there's no chance in victory for Joe Manchin in 2024, and by the end of 2024, they may in fact have been right. And all of these votes and all of these articles that are written about Joe Manchin throttling the Democratic Party would either be for Joe Manchin or for nobody itself. And I think that, at the end of the day, might end up being the Democratic Party's one of their major regrets, one of Joe Manchin's major regrets. But again, I am not one to question his thought process or his morality when it comes down to many of these votes, but what I am going to say is that a lot of what he's doing right now definitely seems like he's doing it for political advantage in 2024, but it is entirely possible that the state of West Virginia is too polarized and too Republican, too partisan to re-elect their Democratic senator that had been a long-standing person across the state's partisan politics. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below, subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.